Good evening. Welcome to Disputatio. This is the second philosophy event of the 2014-2015 academic year. The other occurred earlier today. Our event this evening is a debate between Father Bill Miscamble, Dr. David Solomon, and Aquinas' own Dr. Robert Marko. This is the first installment of what I hope will become a continuing philosophy series at Aquinas College. The aim of Disputatio is to gather exceptional scholars, students, faculty, and members of the Aquinas community to engage in discussion of serious moral issues in a collegial manner. One of the great benefits of philosophical reflection, and in turn a benefit of a strong philosophy program, especially at a liberal arts college, is the opportunity to carefully, respectfully, and at a very high level engage these challenging issues. I cannot think of anyone better for our inaugural event than Father Miscamble, Dr. Solomon, and Dr. Marko. I will not belabor you with speaking and going through long introductions. I think many of you who were at the event earlier or just know Father Bill, Professor Miscamble, Father Bill, David Solomon, and Bob Marko in other contexts. Dr. Marko is chair of the theology department and professor of theology here at Aquinas. He has done work on obliteration bombing and work on peace. Professor Solomon comes to us from the University of Notre Dame, where he is the associate professor of philosophy. He is the founder of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture and has written widely in philosophy, including work on Sellers and much work in virtue theory. However, if you ask him, I suspect he will tell you that his greatest philosophical achievement was his direction of a now somewhat recent dissertation on the concept of human dignity. Father Bill Miscamble is professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. Father Miscamble is an excellent historian and has written on President Harry Truman. One book in particular, which has been especially helpful for my own understanding of these events, is Father Bill's The Most Controversial Decision. I recommend at least chapter 7, though the whole book is wonderful. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers and welcoming Dr. Solomon and Father Bill to Aquinas College. My name is Brian Pilkington, and I'm the assistant professor of philosophy here at Aquinas, and I'm very happy that all of you are here. What will happen tonight is, for about 20 minutes or so, Father Bill will set the stage and offer his arguments. This will be followed by Professor Marko and then Professor Solomon. We'll leave a few minutes at the end for Father Bill to respond or answer any questions that may be posed. After this, which should take about an hour, we'll have 30 minutes or so for any questions from all of you. So thank you very much, and please welcome Father Bill to the mic.
Put that up a little. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you at Aquinas, and I want to especially thank Brian for all of his organizing efforts. Most folks have pretty strongly held views on the morality of Truman's use of the atomic bombs. But I want to ask you tonight to bracket your judgment, if you would, and be open to reflect on the history that surrounds his decision. There's often a rush to judge Truman based on very limited historical knowledge of the basis for his decision-making and of the situation that he confronted. This process has been aided by the unfortunate influence of some very bad history, such as that written by Garel Perovitz and other members of the so-called atomic diplomacy school, and this school keeps sort of reinventing itself over time. These historians have alleged that Truman proceeded to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which he supposedly knew was on the verge of surrender, and that he did this so as to intimidate the Soviet Union in the already developing Cold War. That specious interpretation deserves no further consideration. Now, at times, philosophers, like my treasured colleague here, Professor Solomon, and perhaps even theologians, I do not know for sure about Professor Marko, but at times, philosophers and theologians can be rather abstract and limited in their understanding of the war against Japan in 1945 and of the viable courses of action open to Harry Truman. Knowing Professor Solomon as I do, it's likely that tonight he will be seeking to channel the sainted Elizabeth Anscombe, his heroine in these matters. And undoubtedly, some philosophers see understanding the military and political realities that Truman confronted as completely irrelevant. I am not with them on that point. A good historian is more grounded and so struggles to understand something of the world of the policymakers such as Truman confronted, with its inevitable compromises, constantly competing pressures. The historian accepts the complexity, the uncertainty, the sheer messiness of policymaking during wartime, the fog of war, and acknowledges the tense atmosphere in which policymakers operated. Might I ask all of you gathered here that before any of you condemn Truman's action, that you first understand what exactly occurred and why he took the action he did. I hope you might see that a good historical understanding aids the task of moral analysis. By July of 1945, the Japanese had been subjected to months of devastating attacks by American B-29s. Their capital city and other major cities had suffered extensive damage, and the home islands were subjected to a naval blockade that made food and fuel increasingly scarce. The Japanese military and civilian losses had reached approximately 3 million, and there seemed no end in sight. Despite all of this, however, Japan's leaders, and especially its military, clung fiercely to notions of getsu-go, decisive battle. That is, they held to a plan that involved inflicting such punishment on the invader in defense of their homeland that the invader, that is the United States, would be the one who would sue for terms, who would give up the fight. Please note that in the spring of 1945, the Japanese government enacted a series of mobilization measures. Among these measures was a law making all males aged 15 to 60 and all females aged 17 to 40 members of a huge national militia. The Japanese Defense Agency official history of the preparations for the defense of Kyushu goes into great detail on the implementation of this program down to the village level. So we have, if you will, a nation mobilizing for war on a vast scale. The net result was to make literally millions of persons in these two categories members of organized military units. As the brilliant historian Richard Frank suggests, these measures, quote, converted something approaching or more likely exceeding half the adult population into combatants. Confirming the Japanese determination to fight on is the fact that even after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, after the Soviet attack in Manchuria, the Japanese military still wanted to pursue that military option. But the Emperor, Hirohito, broke the impasse in the Japanese government and ordered surrender. He came to understand that the atomic bombs undermined the fundamental premise of Getsu-go, that the United States would have to invade Japan to secure a decision. Ultimately, the atomic bombs allowed the Emperor and the so-called peace faction in the Japanese government to negotiate an end to the war. Now, of course, the United States could have defeated Japan without the atomic bomb. But one must appreciate that the viable alternate scenarios to secure victory, continued obliteration bombing of Japanese cities and infrastructure, a choking blockade, the likely terrible invasions involving massive firepower would have meant significantly greater Allied casualties and much, much higher Japanese civilian and military casualties. Let me note here that as Soviet forces battled through Manchuria, just to get clear, Hiroshima bombing August 6th, Soviet declaration of war August 8th, Nagasaki bombing August 9th. So the Soviets have invaded into Manchuria and then into the Kuril Islands as of August 8th. They kept that fight on for a couple of weeks. As the Soviet forces battled, approximately 2.7 million Japanese fell into their hands. Of that number, approximately 400,000 died, not including direct combatant deaths. 400,000 at Soviet hands, non-combatants. Surely an indicator of the likely loss of civilian lives through conventional fighting. This number, 400,000, is well over twice the number of deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course some of the deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in fact military combatant deaths. Now, of course, the overall casualties would also have included thousands of Allied prisoners of war whom the Japanese planned to execute. Notably, all these options also assuredly would have involved indirectly some intentional killing of innocents, including the naval blockade, which sought to starve the Japanese into submission and would have been conducted in conjunction with massive bombardments of Japanese coastal cities. Hard as it may be to accept when one sees the terrible visual evidence of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese losses would assuredly have been substantially greater without the A-bombs. Moreover, the use of these terrible weapons abruptly ended the death and suffering of innocent third parties among peoples throughout Asia, an often overlooked group. Rather surprisingly, the enormous wartime losses of the Chinese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Javanese at the hands of the Japanese received little attention in weighing the American effort to shock the Japanese into surrender. The losses in Hiroshima and Nagasaki assuredly were horrific, but they pale in significance when compared to the estimates of 17 to 24 million deaths attributed to the Japanese during their hideous rampage from Manchuria through to New Guinea. As the thoughtful scholar Robert Newman has revealed, the last months were in many ways the worst. Starvation and disease aggravated the usual beatings, beheadings, and battle deaths. It's plausible to hold that upwards of 250,000 people, mostly Asians, but some Westerners, would have died each month the Japanese Empire struggled on beyond July of 1945, 250,000 per month. Surely these people also are innocents deserving of some concern in our moral calculations. What is the moral culpability of a passive bystander, so to speak, who could have taken some action to stop this vast killing, but did not? Bluntly put, the atomic bomb shortened the war, averted the need for a land invasion, saved countless more lives on both sides of the ghastly conflict than they cost, and brought an end to the Japanese brutalization of the conquered peoples of Asia. I must jump ahead to here in my little talk. I'm going too long, sorry. We must ask, was it right? I suggest in my book that in retrospect and within the privacy of his own heart, Truman worried that he had been forced to enter into something that he perceived was evil. He ordered the bombing of cities possessing significant military-industrial value, but in which thousands of non-combatants were annihilated. Yet, as those of you in Professor Pilkington's class who read my chapter would know, I remained sympathetic in evaluating Truman and his decision. He was a person who knew that decisions in the confusing fog of war place the policymaker in circumstances where he sometimes does not have a clear or easy moral option. Perhaps Truman had himself and the A-bomb decision retrospectively in mind when he wrote 15 years after their use in a discourse on decision-making, this is in his book, Mr. Citizen, that quote, listen to this: "Sometimes you have a choice of evils, in which case you try to take the course that is likely to bring the least harm." That is how his decision regarding the atomic bomb should be assessed. From the perspective of over 6 decades, Truman's use of the bomb, when viewed in the context of this long and terrible war, should be seen as his choosing the least awful of the options available to him. Henry Stimson had it exactly right when he wrote in 1947, Stimson was the Secretary of War, "The decision to use the atomic bomb was a decision that brought death to over 100,000 Japanese. No explanation can change that fact, and I do not wish to gloss over it, but this deliberate, premeditated destruction was our least abhorrent choice. Abhorrent for sure, but it must be understood the least abhorrent as well, so as to bring the bloodshed to an end." It is when one turns to alternate courses of action that the abstract nature of many criticisms of Truman become notably apparent. The critics offer no serious proposal regarding a viable alternative. Elizabeth Anscombe, my dear friend's heroine, naively suggested that Truman alter the terms of surrender. But such an approach would have strengthened the hand of the Japanese militarists and confirmed them in their suicidal strategy of fighting on. In an exchange I have had with one very capable philosopher, he conceded that it might well be that greater suffering would have resulted from a refusal to use the atomic weapons in Japan. But no one wants to look at what that greater suffering would be. Folks simply want to rush to judgment against Truman. No one wants to count how many innocent lives it would have cost. Should philosophers and perhaps theologians be able to avoid outlining what they would have done in the demanding circumstances that Truman confronted? I have always thought that moral reflection wrestled with the awful and painful realities. Can philosophers and theologians just stand above the fray, simply pronounce Truman's actions as deeply immoral, and then leave it at that? I think it would bring further clarity to this discussion if they moved to confront the real question seriously. If they did engage the military issues involved in the war in the Pacific, I suspect they would be forced to raise further objections to American military practices pursued well before the Enola Gay flew towards Hiroshima. Take as an example the early 1945 battle for Manila, in which approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed. Have you ever heard of them? Do they ever get any moral recognition? We constantly hear of the 80,000 Japanese killed in Hiroshima. Who has heard of the Filipinos killed as the United States, with massive conventional firepower, took the Filipino capital from the hands of the Japanese. The harsh tactics used in that conventional conflict could never meet the criteria of critics. But what military means would they support? Critics could hardly approve of the military force used in the taking of Okinawa and the high number of civilian casualties there. Estimates are that perhaps 140,000 Okinawan civilians lost their lives during that awful campaign. Perhaps Professor Solomon, maybe Professor Marko will say that it would be better to do absolutely nothing and just to live with the consequences, if I may use that word, which I suspect Professor Solomon will use against me. Get ready for consequentialism, my friends. Perhaps they would hold to what might be called a functionally pacifist position, because no effective military action could avoid some major civilian casualties. We should be under no doubt, however, that this decision not to act would have involved terrible consequences. And would not such inaction carry some burden of responsibility for the prolongation of the killing of innocents throughout Asia in the charnel house that was the Japanese Empire? Is it really moral to stand aside maintaining one's supposed moral purity while a vast slaughter occurred at the rate of over 200,000 deaths per month? Isn't there a terrible, indeed a tragic dilemma here? Namely, which innocent lives to save? Would Truman's critics really have rested at peace with the long-term Japanese domination of Asia? Let me conclude. I have to confess that I would prefer that my position had the same clarity as that of Truman's many critics. One has no doubt conceded a lot when one admits that Truman's action was abhorrent. Arguing that it was the least harmful of the options open to him is hardly designed to persuade those who see everything in very sharp black and white focus and who always believe that there must have been some nice solution to end this awful struggle. Yet, this is how I see it. If someone can place before me a viable and more moral way to have defeated the Japanese and ended World War II, I will change my position. I suppose my position here has some resonance with my support for the policy of deterrence during the Cold War. I could recognize the moral flaws in the strategy of deterrence, the threatening of civilian populations with nuclear attack, but I found it the best of the available options, and the alternatives were markedly worse. Interestingly, I think John Paul II, the author of Veritatis Splendor, thought the same thing, and he conveyed that view to the American bishops as they wrote the Peace Pastoral. This is my recommendation. At future anniversaries of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when they occur, I want less moralizing condemnation of Truman's decision until the critics specify at least a more moral and yet still feasible course to end this terrible war. Perhaps there might even be some empathy for a man who felt required to make the decision and who carried the burden of it. Harry Truman of Independence, Missouri, was not a moral monster who now needs to be placed retrospectively on trial for war crimes. Those who from the safe distance of over 65 years criticize his decision would do well to place themselves in his shoes and ask what they might have done in the circumstances. Or instead, perhaps they simply might pray that leaders in our own time and in the future are never forced by horrible circumstances to to make such decisions. Thank you so much.
I've entitled my remarks, Truman and the Atomic Bombing to Defeat Japan, Objectively Immoral but Subjectively Not Culpable. That's, in that sense, I think my position will be somewhere in between the two positions that will be laid out. First, however, I'd like to thank Dr. Pilkington for the invitation to participate in this conversation with such outstanding scholars from the University of Notre Dame. The last time I formally addressed a topic of war was at the first Persian Gulf War, before most of the traditional age students were born, and Brian was 7 years old in Atlanta at the Catholic Theological Society of America. Brian and I work together. We teach together. He would be considered to be an egghead philosopher, according to Truman, and I'm a simple theologian. I often mention to him that what David Burrell, who is a brother of Father Miscamble, once said to me at lunch in the dining room below in Wege about the discipline of theology and the discipline of philosophy. Burrell, who is now retired, I don't know where he is, Bangladesh or someplace, yes, held dual appointments at Notre Dame in these two departments. And he said to me very simply, if I want clarity of thinking, I go to philosophy. If I want to deal with real life, I go to theology. Hopefully this evening, there will be both some clarity of thinking and also we will deal with real life. Moreover, given the fact that we have an esteemed historian here, this disputatio, this dialogue relying on the sources of tradition and understanding and some reasoning should at least clarify the issues. And I think having history here reminds us that real life is even more complicated than theologians think. My remarks this evening will be divided into three parts like all Gaul. First, I will identify what I found most valuable in Miscamble's text. And what it did is dispel a lot of the myths under which I've been operating for years. Secondly, I will explore from the discipline of theology the moral problem of obliteration, carpet, whole city, or area bombing. My principal resource will be reputedly the best article ever written in the history of the esteemed Jesuit journal, Theological Studies, John C. Ford's 1944 article, The Obliteration of Morality of Obliteration and Bombing. I actually have the 1944 article there. Third, I will offer my own position on Father Miscamble's work and the morality of dropping a bomb. And here I will rely on what Brian has already suggested is the crucial chapter, which is chapter 7. And he does revise chapter 7 somewhat. He does not sanctify Machiavelli as he does in the original text. All right. You can talk about...
I've been beaten up enough on
all right,
that.
okay, all right. Part 1, Father Miscamble's text. When Brian asked me what I thought about dropping a bomb on Japan, my response was categorically, it was objectively immoral. I am a post-World War II baby boomer. My father had served in the European theater and then the Army Air Corps as a turret gun operator. But as I came to age, I tended towards some form of pacifism. And my wife will recall that when our oldest son, John, was 3, he would accompany Dad to the Hiroshima protest on August 6th down at Point State Park in Pittsburgh. And this baby boomer, by the way, held membership for many years in Pax Christi USA until their ethic became incredibly inconsistent. And I've served as a volunteer in the Catholic Worker House. Be that as it may, I think it's interesting for someone of my background to look at some of the unquestioned myths that I've operated under, and I think Father Miscamble's work corrects. First, the one he's already mentioned. This is the dominant theory I had about the dropping of the bomb, and I'll let the historians, we got 3 of them here, to talk about the truth of this. The dropping of the atomic bomb was part of a post-World War II strategy to intimidate Stalin and the Soviet Union. Second, the bomb would never be used against the Germans. Actually, it was intended for that purpose because the United States was racist, as seen in the policy of the Japanese internment. I recall a lecture when I was an undergraduate in American history at Duquesne University, where the professor who eventually became vice president at your sister's university, St. Joseph, spoke about how Japanese and Germans were seen in movies of the time and subsequent times, and how they were portrayed quite differently. Third, Japan was on the verge of surrender. I believe that. And our reasonable demand for unconditional surrender, which was, by the way, asked of Germany, made that impossible. All the Japanese wanted to do was to keep the emperor. I would agree with Father Miscamble that the peace party, and if it wasn't for the peace party and Emperor Hirohito, the military would have never surrendered. Fourth, in light of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Japanese, and not the other people of Asia, nor the prisoners of war, were the real victims. This despite the Bataan Death March, despite the rape of Nanking, and the real victims were only the Japanese. I think it's a kind of a mentality that I developed. Fifth, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were primarily civilian targets, where in reality, as Father Miscamble points out, Nagasaki was a port city, Hiroshima housed a Japanese military, communication center, et cetera, et cetera. Sixth, the pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, on which I wrote my dissertation, was seen at, and I can't find a source for this anywhere, but I hope that Father Miscamble may find one, was a form of repentance of the American Roman Catholic bishops for the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's interesting that in that particular document, while essentially advocating a practical nuclear pacifism, and certainly against MAD, did not demand the disposition of nuclear weapons, to be sure. All right, part two, the morality of obliteration bombing. Again, I mentioned my resource. It's John Ford's work. Ford's article has been called by Georgetown moral theologian, expert on the issue of war and peace, or the ethics of war and peace, John Langan, as the most widely influential article ever to appear in theological studies. In 2005, this 1944 article was reprinted in Theological Studies, and it was so cited also by the then editor of Theological Studies, Michael Fahey. Ford begins his article this way. In general, the term obliteration bombing is used as an opposite of precision bombing. In precision bombing, every definite limited target, such as airfields, munitions factories, railroad bridges, etc., are picked out and aimed at. But in obliteration bombing, the target is not a well-defined military objective, as that term has been understood in the past. The target is a large area, for instance, a whole city, or all the built-up part of a city, or at least a large section of the built-up area, often included by design residential districts. In the article, the end of quotation, in the article, Ford is dealing with two concerns: confessional practice and a moral evaluation of obliteration and bombing. For the first, Ford believes that a confessor can give absolution to a bomber engaged in this practice unless the penitent is convinced it is immoral. He allows this not because Ford believes in probabilism in this case, or that is we do not know if it's wrong or there are varying positions on this, because he really believed it was wrong. So he doesn't base this on a position of probabilism. But he does not want to impose on anybody an obligation where the norm does not appear to be certain. Ford then makes a case for why obliteration bombing is immoral and thus why the norm is certain. He does so on the basis of the principle of non-combatant immunity, about which Father Miscamble's already referred to, although he recognizes quite honestly that it's increasingly difficult to make moral decisions and distinctions in situations of total war where civilians are so involved. Hence, Ford posits the moral problem raised by obliteration bombing with two questions. Do the majority of citizens in a modern nation at war enjoy a natural law right of immunity from violent repression? Question one. Secondly, does obliteration bombing necessarily involve a violation of the rights of innocent citizens? He answers both in the affirmative. His reasoned position is that, and I quote him here, "It is fundamental in the Catholic view that to take the life of an innocent person is always intrinsically wrong. That is forbidden absolutely by natural law. Neither the state nor any private individual can thus dispose of the lives of the innocent. The killing of enemy soldiers in warfare was justified by the older writers on the theory that they were not innocent but guilty. They were guilty of unjust aggression or of a violation of rights which could be forcibly vindicated. The individual enemy soldier might be only materially guilty, but it was his guilt and their immediate cooperation in violent, unjust acts that made them legitimate objects of direct killing." And then Ford concludes this particular section, "As far as I know, this distinction between innocent and guilty has never been abandoned by Catholic theologians. They still maintain that it's always intrinsically wrong to kill directly the innocent civilians of the enemy country." And that's certainly the crux of where I'll go in the end. To the quick, Ford does not deny that some non-combatants are connected in a very loose way to the war industry. He actually does this, and he shows, charts on this and who we're going to count that connected to the war industry. Bakers, whatever, shoemakers, everybody. Okay. He recognizes that. However, the Allies justified obliteration bombing precisely to discourage the population, terrorize them, if you will, and thinking that if they blew up the homes of the residents near this center, they would move. That's what Ford suggests. Okay, and so therefore he argues this. Is it not evident that the most radical and significant change of all in modern warfare is not the increased cooperation of civilians? He recognizes that clearly behind the lines with the armed forces, but the enormously increased power of armed forces to reach behind the lines and attack civilians indiscriminately, whether they are thus cooperating or not. And I think if you look at the Challenge of Peace document in 1983, this seems to be the nuclear weapons raise a different question. Ford then begins on 289 to the principle of double effect, looking particularly at the conditions of intent and proportionality. And he says this: looking at obliteration bombing as it actually takes place, can we say that the maiming and death of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, which are its immediate result, are not directly intended? I'm going to try to skip some of this. He claims it is. For Ford, one cannot then directly intend to harm the innocent. And then he quotes British and American military to indicate that the intent is to demoralize the enemy, quote, and to bring devastation and fear to the population. Now, he says this: I contend that it's impossible to make civilian terrorization or the undermining of civilian morale an object of bombing without having a direct intent to injure and kill civilians. The basic cause of civilian terror. Now, if this is not the case with the Japanese bombing, I would like to hear that. And it may not be, quite candidly. But there's another principled effect. Okay. If one intends the end terror, one cannot escape intending the means of obtaining that end, the death and injury of civilians. Ford goes on to reject the condition of proportionality in the strategy of target Germany. I'm going to kind of skip a lot of that. But he's saying that condition in the principle of double effect does not, it doesn't come into play here. Okay. Ford, as Father Miscamble does in his work, recognized that there may be proportionate reasons to engage in obliteration bombing. Saving a soldier's life, shortening and winning the war, liberating Europe, beginning to feed the starving people in Europe. In short, Ford relies both on natural law arguments, empirical data to condemn obliteration bombing, and the traditional teaching of the church on the issue, even if it has not been lived perfectly, like many things in the church. Something we call Ecclesiastical Positivism. This argument is found in his quoting of French bishops, a Belgian cardinal, Pius XII, but more significantly in a footnote in which he indicates from the period of the Council of Clermont in 1095 through the first 4 Lateran councils, the right of the innocent's life to be spared was a principle. In the tradition, as we know, the taking of innocent life then is always considered immoral. I think probably Professor Solomon might speak about the exceptions to that, if you will. The principle of discrimination that Ford adopts is also found in the 1965 Pastoral Constitution, God in its Space, the Constitution of the Church. And I just quote that famous passage. Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities of extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and humanity. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation. That same quotation is found in the Catechism of the Church in 1994, and they add this piece to that. A danger of modern war is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially the ABC weapons, atomic, biological, and chemicals, to commit such crimes. That's paragraph 2314. Then in 1995, in Evangelium Vitae, then the Pope of Rome, John Paul II, evoked the universal ordinary magisterium on this issue, saying that therefore by the authority which Christ conferred upon Peter and successors in the communion with all the bishops in the world, I confirm that the direct and voluntary killing of an innocent human being is always gravely wrong. Okay, and this doctrine is based on unwritten law, the natural law of the light of reason in one's own heart, affirmed by the scriptures and transmitted by the tradition of the church and taught by the ordinary universal magisterium. Now to the close. In his revision of his book dealing with the morality of atomic bombing, Father Miscamble contends that the rush to judge Truman harshly is largely based on limited or inaccurate historical knowledge of the basis for his decision and of the situation he confronted. As I indicated in my first part dealing with the spelling of my personal miss, I believe that our author is absolutely right. Moreover, I concede that he may be right in his historical argument that the dropping of the bomb shortened the war. It saved the lives not just of U.S. military, but Japanese military and civilians, other Asians, prisoners of war, etc. No question about it in my mind. In Chapter 7, our Holy Cross priest historian then asks forthrightly, which I think is very great for a historical work, the ethical question as well, despite the question he raises about the historical question. And here's I'm quoting Father Campbell, or Father Miscamble. If the atomic bomb shortened the war, averted the need for a land invasion, saved countless more lives on both sides of the ghastly conflict than they cost, and brought to an end the Japanese brutalization of the conquered peoples of Asia, does this make their use moral? In retrospect, he may have indicated that many people would say no. Truman had second thoughts, as he indicated. Father Miscamble cites Admiral Leahy, Generals MacArthur and Eisenhower, and others. Even the father of the bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, rejected his offspring, all right, and told Truman that Truman had blood on his hands. You see this in Father Miscamble's book, which to me is like the pot calling the kettle black. And I realize, and you probably all realize, that hindsight is always 20/20. And then he goes on and talks about from his perspective. Let me close within a minute because I'm being pushed off stage by this young kid here. All right, and you will live to regret that. All right, all right, maybe not live to regret it. All right, from an historical perspective, one can appreciate his arguments, but from a moral perspective, as I noted in part 2, obliteration bombing is objectively immoral. Ford also noted that one can argue the good effects may proceed from obliteration bombing, but it doesn't make the act moral. Ford's article came out a year before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and was rightly directed at the Allied leaders, Churchill and Franklin Franklin Roosevelt. I see no distinction between their policy and that of Truman, despite the fact that nuclear weapons were more devastating. I'm not even advocating here a position of keeping my hands clean or moral purity abstract from life. I don't want to go through some stuff. I mentioned some things about the challenge of peace and nuclear deterrence. So while I'm not accusing Father Miscamble of being a philosophical utilitarian, maybe Professor Solomon might, or worse, or one of those horrible theological consequentialists or proportionalists like Dick McCormick, the late Dick McCormick, or Charlie Kern that I read as a student and whose books are still in my office. I think the position that he takes is consequentialist when he delves into the ethics of the event. However, I believe that Truman is not in any way more morally culpable than Roosevelt or Churchill, and maybe less so, as I think Father Miscamble rightly points out. Truman struggled with doing the good thing and being a good man. Moreover, from the point of view of the ethics of war and peace, while World War II is clearly just in terms of jus ad bellum conditions, the bombings of Japan and of Europe violated clearly the principle of non-combatant impunity. This points to the difficulty in a total war and nuclear war age. I fear that justified war can too easily slip into a crusade that does not accept God-given limitations. All right, and therefore, my last sentence, there is great wisdom in the tradition of nonviolent resistance found in Gandhi and King when it maintains that I can never fully know the consequences of my action and thus must focus on the means or what I am doing. That is, I ought never to intentionally take the life of an innocent. Thank you. Sorry for that. Stole your material? No, you're Thank you.
Well, let me join my voice to the other panelists to thank Brian for putting on this wonderful panel tonight. He did write a terrific dissertation on human dignity, and it should have earned him a place on this panel, but you have to just sit there and watch your watch and try to keep me from talking all night long. That's the punishment. I'd also like to thank Father Miscamble for tonight only calling philosophers a little abstract. He sometimes has harsher terms, and of course his great mentor, President Truman, regularly called us not only eggheads, as Professor Marko said, but sob sisters as well. There were lots of talk about sob sisters. I did want to correct, before I begin, Professor Marko, on one thing, that quote from Father Burrell. As I recall, what he used to say was, if you wanted clarity, you went to philosophers. If you wanted real life, you went to theologians. And if you wanted neither, you went to historians. That's my recollection. The paper I have here is a little too long to read, and I don't want to cause Brian to be upset. So I'm going to cut out the first half of it. And let me tell you what it is. I compliment Father Miscamble on the history. I'm inclined to think, I'm certainly not going to argue with him about it. He's a historian. He's a leading scholar in the history of American foreign policy, especially during the Cold War, this post-World War II period. Even where I think I might disagree with him on some of these historical details, I suspect he's always going to be right. He loves Harry Truman. I agree with Professor Marko that it's wrong to criticize Harry Truman and let Churchill and Roosevelt off the hook. The terror bombing we did in World War II in Europe was every bit as awful as what went on in Hiroshima. But that's just history, okay? My own view is that Father Miscamble, both in his presentation tonight and in Chapter 7 of his terrific little book, which I agree with Professor Marko you should all read, thinks if he can tell enough historical stories, we'll forget about the moral issues. And I want to pick up, I'm cutting some other things that would have been repetitious after what Professor Marko said, but I want to take a slightly different philosophical cut through these matters. And let me turn from the comments I was going to make about the historical analysis, just saying I'll give Father Miscamble all that, and turn directly to his moral analysis and what we can say about it. And I want to state in the briefest possible way why most of us are horrified by President Truman's decision to drop the bomb, and then raise a couple of points about why I think that in the end, Father Miscamble's moral analysis is simply inadequate, the analysis he gives at the end. We're horrified at what happened because, and here I pick up on some things much more abstractly that Professor Marko was talking about. We're horrified because we regard that action as violating one of what we might call the pillars of what has become the moral consensus, as we might say, of civilized men and women. That is, the view that Monsignor Ford talked about, that it's always and everywhere wrong directly to kill the innocent. That's the issue at the bottom. Both the notion of directly in this formulation and the notion of innocent, as Professor Marko again points out, have been the subject of almost unceasing debate since the principle was firmed up in Western thinking, but many of us think those problems can be handled. We, of course, have always morally allowed killing under this doctrine. One doesn't have to be a pacifist or opposed to killing altogether under this doctrine. But we only allow it when that killing was appropriately indirect or the victims of the killing had in some way surrendered their innocence. The areas of permissible killing in our culture historically have actually fallen into three rather small and well-defined classes. It's not very complicated. We can kill in self-defense when we're responding to lethal force. We can kill combatants in a just war, and we can kill in cases of capital punishment. This is the most liberal we can be about killing. Of course, some people think we should be more restricted than that. In each of these three cases, the victim of the killing has lost his or her innocence. In the case of self-defense, by being an unjust aggressor, promising violence, lethal violence. In the case of war, by being a member of an opposing army pursuing unjust ends. In the case of capital punishment, by being found guilty in a court of law guided by just principles. It's also a part of this view for most persons that it can be anchored in reason, natural law reason of one sort or another, or in fundamental Christian and Jewish teaching. I do not want to deny that this attitude toward direct killing of the innocent is fiercely contested both historically by philosophers like Machiavelli and others, and by moderns such as the contemporary moral philosopher Peter Singer and other defenders of infanticide and the killing of the developmentally disabled. But I doubt that Father Miscamble wants to be in their camp. Although many persons have dissented from this view, let me go on. Father Miscamble certainly does not explicitly dissent from the view. Indeed, he doesn't mention it. Insofar as his treatment can be regarded as a defense of Truman's action, he makes no reference to this framing view in our tradition whatsoever, that it's always and everywhere wrong to directly kill the innocent. But does Father Miscamble really even give a moral defense of Truman's decision to drop the bombs? I don't think so, although he leaves no doubt that he deeply admires Truman, and that's possible even if you believe Truman did one or two horrible things, and is just a little ticked off at Truman's morally prissy critics. The argument, even in Chapter 7 of his book and in his presentation tonight, where he claims to be addressing the moral issue head on, when we finally get to Chapter 7, that's where he's supposed to take on the moral issue, his argument is surprisingly indirect. He spends most of that chapter actually attempting to show things like Truman's dropping of the bomb likely prevented a great deal of suffering, so forth. Some ideologically driven left-wing historians have smeared Truman by suggesting ulterior motives for dropping the bomb. 3, that none of his military advisors opposed this, that already there had been the fire bombings of European cities were every bit as bad as that, and so on. But these are things that I'm all willing to grant him. I not want to suggest that these points that Father Miscamble so lovingly presents are irrelevant to our understanding of Truman's motivations and the overall setting within which he made his decision. And as a good Aristotelian in ethics, I certainly take social context to be important in ethics. I do think, however, that they prevent him from coming to the ethical point, getting down to the real point. What are we going to say about Truman's decision to directly kill the innocent as a matter of moral analysis? The history is okay, but all of you aren't in this room tonight on a weekday night to hear us argue about historical details of what happened in August of 1945. We're interested in the moral issue. The closest Father Miscamble comes to addressing the fundamental ethical issue is in the closing paragraph of Chapter 7 and in a nearly closing paragraph in his presentation tonight, in which he pursues what we might call his lesser evil strategy. He says near the end of his talk, from the perspective of over 6 decades, Truman's use of the bomb, when viewed in the context of the long and terrible war, should be seen as his choosing the lesser of the evils available to him. Father Miscamble goes on to say that, quote, fair-minded observers will see that he chose what might be termed a necessary evil. And he says that Henry Stimson, in advising had it exactly right when he defended Truman's decision by saying that this deliberate, premeditated destruction was our least abhorrent choice. Now, I take that to be the crucial moral argument in this very elegant paper of Father Miscamble's. Now, he barely develops these points enough, I think, for us to get a firm grasp on them as moral arguments, but he does say enough for us to have some worries about them. Let me raise one worry about this and also address another ethical claim very briefly. Father Miscamble makes throughout his paper, and address another ethical claim that Miscamble makes throughout his paper that would have particularly irritated Elizabeth Anscombe, who's kind of the target of this. With regard to the lesser evil strategy, the phrase the lesser evil suggests, sorry about this, Father Miscamble, that we're in the realm of broadly utilitarian thinking. And certainly Father Miscamble spends much time in his book calculating the consequences of alternative actions in a way that reminds one of a utilitarian approach to this matter. Now, I take utilitarianism in this context, in the broadest possible sense, where it merely suggests that the rightness of actions, and that's what we're talking about here, the rightness of actions are to be determined by the nature and value of their consequences overall. There are a million variations of this view, but that's what they all hold in common. Now, Miscamble has been accused by others as being a straightforward utilitarian. I'm not going to do that because he also says lots of things in his book and elsewhere that suggests he rejects utilitarianism, and one would expect him to. In particular, he agrees that the dropping of the bomb was a morally terrible action, even when he asks us to commend Truman for choosing it. This is an attitude hardly open to a utilitarian, because he's defended the view that it's the best thing we could do, although it's still terrible. What are we to make of his lesser evil view, then, if it's not a form of utilitarian reasoning? Now, I think it's a closely related view that I have called, in other contexts arguing with him about this, utilitarianism in a pinch. Father Miscamble makes much of the tragic nature of Truman's choice, that either choice was horrible, that his situation took the form of a moral dilemma, that it was impossible to avoid doing evil. Whatever he did was going to be morally abhorrent. This is all language from his paper. That's to use the language actually of Henry Stimson. From this claim that there's no action open to one that is free of moral fault, Miscamble seems to conclude that it's open to one in this situation to simply act for the best, to be a utilitarian when any action one chooses will be morally deeply objectionable. It is as though he believes that tragic dilemmas in our life license us to be utilitarians, just for a little bit maybe. Hence, utilitarianism in a pinch, when we're in a tight spot. I invite Father Miscamble to tell me whether I have him right on this matter, and if not, could he tell us how he would put his view in sort of general terms of this sort? If I do have him right, let me make two comments on this view and conclude with those. First, it doesn't seem at all obvious to me that moral dilemmas should yield this consequence. We have already rejected utilitarianism if we believe we can get into these sorts of dilemmas. Utilitarianism does not allow these sorts of dilemmas. Why then should we find it more acceptable in cases where, as it were, we need it to break a tie? Why bring it back in? It seems to me deeply counterintuitive that we would find utilitarianism unacceptable for ordinary moral reasoning, but feel obliged to turn to it when the going gets really rough. If we find it unacceptable for ordinary cases, why shouldn't it be even more unacceptable for these really tough cases? It is as though a football player wasn't good enough to play during regulation time, but we felt compelled to bring him in overtime when the whole game is on the line. And that seems to me to be problematic. But my second comment, do we really have a tragic dilemma here after all? Was President Truman in a tragic dilemma of this sort? Is it the case that whatever he did would have been morally abhorrent? I don't think so. And let me remind you here of Elizabeth Anscombe's teaching on this matter. Anscombe, who we haven't noted this tonight, but who was the philosopher who led the opposition to giving Harry Truman an honorary degree at Oxford in 1955. And only got 3 votes from the entire Oxford faculty in support of her opposition to giving him an honorary degree. I've often thought, with the faculty at Oxford today, given the opportunity to insult an American president, they would unanimously support it. But only 3 people supported Elizabeth Anscombe on this matter. Anscombe thought the most important mistake in 20th century ethics, and here again I look back more abstractly to some things Professor Marko said, the most important mistake in 20th century ethics was the mistake that she thought had undermined modern moral philosophy, was the mistake of not sharply distinguishing what we intend in action and what we merely foresee as the results of our action. We're responsible in a special way for what we intend, that is, for what we do intentionally. We may foresee, as the consequences of our actions or inactions, all sorts of horrible things. But insofar as these consequences are not the objects of our intentions, we are not in the same way responsible for them. In particular, we are not responsible for the consequences of my refraining from doing an intrinsically evil action. We're simply not responsible for that. In accord with this view, Truman was not choosing, as Father Miscamble suggests, between directly killing 100,000 innocents if he dropped the bomb and killing perhaps 1 million whose deaths he could foresee if he didn't drop the bomb. Dropping the bomb involved the intention directly to kill the innocent in a way that refraining from dropping the bomb did not involve the intention to kill the 1 million victims. Even if I could foresee this outcome, there are all kinds of outcomes of our actions we can foresee that we surely don't intend and for which we are not responsible. I am not responsible in the same way for the outcomes that result from my refraining from performing an intrinsically evil action that I would be for the direct consequences of my intentional actions. Now, this is a hard doctrine, and it can seem a picky and abstract point, as I suspect Father Miscamble would say. I hesitate always to remind people this. Father Miscamble is a practical man. He's the son of a butcher, which doesn't have any special connection to our discussion tonight, but he's a man close to real life, and I apologize for this picky and abstract point. Throughout his wonderful book, Father Miscamble portrays himself and Truman as down-to-earth and practical men, prepared to do the hard and sometimes dirty work of the world, while eggheads, philosophers and theologians, piffle away with abstract arguments about good and evil. We would all like to be men of action, not constrained by paper scruples and abstractions in which we sometimes lose ourselves. But ideas, alas, have consequences. We can now go back and replay those decisions in August of 1945, when political leaders were already so compromised morally by decisions they had taken through 6 years of ferocious battle. They were so compromised that they couldn't think clearly about when they were crossing moral lines that should not be crossed. We can take the leisure of peace, however, the kind of leisure we have tonight for Brian's wonderful debate here. We can take the leisure of peace to think through these matters thoroughly so that next time we'll be better prepared to fight evil without slipping into it. Thank you.
Let me have the chance to offer. Can you hear me there? You get me at the back? Just a few thoughts in response to my colleague. Nothing he has said has particularly surprised me. I was waiting to see whether my dear father's occupation would get a mention here tonight, and I'm delighted that it did. My dad loved being a butcher, and I helped him write a book about his experience serving meat in a small Australian country town. He was not a pacifist, but he was not a warmonger either, and he was a practical man. note that neither of my colleagues have taken up my challenge to suggest an alternate course. They have focused on their theoretical analysis, but there's a surprising lack of concern, particularly with Professor Solomon's analysis, for the other innocents that are being killed while this events that we're talking about were occurring. Was continued conventional bombing of Japanese cities to continue? This is the context in which, of course, a policymaker has to make his decisions. Professor Solomon accuses me of utilitarianism in a pinch, but in a way, isn't this how, I'm not conceding utilitarianism, but I'm conceding how policymakers have to make decisions, that they have to wrestle with actions that, as Truman himself said, there's no easy course. And I ask you again, what was the superior course of action that Truman might have pursued? So Elizabeth Anscombe can say, look, was there really a tragic dilemma? Believe me, if you were seated in the Oval Office in August of 1945, you felt a strong sense of trying to choose a course of action in which lives would be saved. Lives would be saved. What we intend versus the consequences of our action. I would concede David's point on that distinction if we were talking about a one-off event. If we were talking about something that we're just going to make a calculation. But we're talking about a war that in Asia has gone on since the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. There's been endless killing for years and years, and Truman does know what the consequences are. He's the president who received the battle casualties from Okinawa. He's the president who not only knew of these ghastly American losses, which of course I'm not presenting Truman as a case for canonization. He's more concerned about American lives than the lives of the Japanese. But he has looked at Okinawan losses. Okinawan losses exceed those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. I think David skates too quickly over and wants to make this black and white distinction between what we intend and the consequences. Here is Truman's intention. It was not to kill the innocent. Truman had overseen the distribution of warnings for civilians to evacuate Japanese cities. Truman had encouraged civilians to leave any area where there were military and industrial targets. Truman's intention was to destroy those military and industrial targets and to take out major centers of Japanese military and industrial strength. That was his intention. His intention was not to kill women and children. He knew that if he could inflict a shock upon the Japanese leadership, it might in fact save the lives of many more women and children, and indeed it did. I want to just offer one brief response. I thank Professor Marko and Professor Solomon for their comments. On this distinction, there's no doubt that Truman expected that the use of this bomb would cause a kind of terror, but it was not, he was expecting or worrying too much about a terror for innocent civilians. You can accuse him of blithely passing over that. What he hoped it would cause would be a change of mind in a fierce Japanese leadership. And ultimately, that's what it did. Any alternate course would have been morally much worse. Thanks again.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. What we'll have now is about a half hour or so where anyone in the audience can ask questions. What I do ask that you do is make your way to one of the mics, which are over here and over here. If you're unable to do so, we have a roving mic, but would strongly prefer going to either side. Also, one minor point of direction, if you could please ask a question that may seem obvious but isn't always the case. So, and you may direct the question to anyone on the panel you wish.
Here we go.
Yes, Jim, thank you.
First of all, thank you for being here. My question is to the panel as a whole, so if all three of you guys could take a moment to answer. Given your views on this particular subject, do you think that we should ever consider using atomic weapons again in the future, perhaps even in our current situation in the Middle East?
I have maintained that Truman's decision was a decision based on limited knowledge of the damage that atomic weapons would do, and he was using weapons that are of such a baby sort, dare I say, compared to the strength of the weaponry available today. It's inconceivable for me that they could be used on any civilian target in our own time. I do see some sort of circumstance in the old days of, dare I say, the Cold War, when you guys were just gleams in your parents' eye. It was conceivable to think of battlefield nuclear weapons if there had been a mass Soviet invasion, say, through the Fulda Gap or something like that. It's conceivable. I'm not recommending it, but possible. I certainly don't see any use for such weapons in the Middle East. None at all.
I would concur with Father Miscamble about no counterpopulation use at all of nuclear weapons. Is it conceivable to use in response a tactical nuclear weapon in the Antarctic or something, when someone else is using them and you do it in response? Yeah, I think it's conceivable. Interesting topic. This was part of the much I cut from the text, but the very same priests that I know from Ukraine who pray for peace from on high, and also I should probably use the mic. Yeah. And also pray for those who love us and those who hate us, said, you know, we made a mistake with those Budapest memorandums in 1994 because we're at the mercy of the Soviet godless. I think there's I think that, yeah, no counterpopulation weapon should be used. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll make that unanimous. It's hard to imagine. Although I do think it's probably a dangerous thing in our thinking about this for us to think that there's something specially awful about atomic weapons as opposed. We can do an awful lot of bad things with conventional weapons. One reason I think we shouldn't use them now is because we've had this long period without using them, and there's a kind of a barrier that's respected there. And I think everybody worries about if we ever break through that barrier, what that could mean. I mean, this is a kind of consequentialist argument. There are also terrifically tough questions about whether we can bluff about using them. Yeah. What if we're, which is one of the great things about the late part of the Cold War. if we were prepared not ever to use them, could we pretend that we would use them? And could we actually paint cardboard boxes like missile silos and try to scare people? And that's a difficult question. In general, the kind of things that, what I was trying to say in my last paragraph is something that Father Miscamble's appreciation of the awfulness for Truman at the end of the war, it's his depiction of that was sort of moving me. We can get ourselves into situations where it's hard to know how moral evaluation can go on at all. By the time Truman was trying to make that decision in August of 1945, given all that had gone on, and in Father Miscamble's larger book on Truman's foreign policy, there's a lot of account of what they were talking about, trying to bring that war to an end. And it's hard to know how moral analysis can go on. And that's a bit the case with nuclear weapons in the Cold War. We got ourselves into this situation where they had a bunch of them and we had a bunch of them, and it was unclear any longer what the tactical consequences of making certain decisions. And that's why I said we need to sort of think through this so we can start at earlier stages, avoiding getting into certain kinds of situations. Now, how we do that, this is the closest I can come to answering Father Miscamble's very pressing question, what would you have done? I don't know what I would have done if I had been Truman, but I would have tried. I know that it would have been right for me not to drop the bomb. I don't have any doubt about that. How one proceeded at that time, given the situation we were in, is that's why we feel sorry for him, and probably our blame for him is not going to be as great as it would be if he had had easier alternatives, I suppose.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Barros.
Thank you all. I really enjoyed the debate, and this question is really directed for Professor Solomon. If you could follow up, please, on the distinction between the intent behind the action versus what we merely foresee,
Right.
and specifically responding to Father Miscamble's final remark there. I served for 21 years in the Air Force, and it's very difficult for me to conceive of scenarios where people are deliberately intending to kill the civilian population, especially in today. I know some people may have that perspective, but if Truman truly tried to oversee warnings to evacuate and sought to give the civilian population a chance to remove themselves from a dangerous situation, how would that change the moral analysis of his decision to drop the bomb? How would that change or mitigate his culpability?
Well, I don't think it would change it very much. There are tough empirical questions about what he could really have believed, how he really could believe those warnings could have had any real effect, given the situation in Japan at the time, the difficulty it would have been for civilians to leave these areas and so forth. But the larger question about the merely foreseen having a different, being related to our responsibility in a different way, I'd take to be one of the deepest and most fundamental ideas in all of ethics. And here's just one reason why it's so deep and fundamental. If you regard yourself as responsible for all the bad actions the bad consequences of the actions you perform that you can foresee, but not intent, then you put yourself open immediately to moral blackmail at every moment in your life. In the following way, suppose somebody wants me to kill 1,000 innocent people for whatever reason. All they have to do is arrange things in my life such that if I don't perform the action that they want me to perform that will kill the 1,000, they will rig something else that will kill 10,000. And so we immediately find ourselves in a situation where we're morally blackmailed into doing something. And that's really kind of what happens in war. I mean, that's why the Soviets put the nuclear weapons in the populated areas, because they were saying, look, if you want to take this action, we're going to make the consequences, which you can foresee that you're going to have to kill people. And then if our merely foreseeing that is something we're responsible for, then I think we get precisely into the line of reasoning that Father Miscamble was exploring, and we say, well, if I have to choose between killing 1,000 people or 10,000 people, it looks like I should just kill 1,000. So they get you killing 1,000. I want you to tell a lie. All I've got to do is arrange things so that if you don't tell this lie, 10 other people will. I'll have 10 other people telling lies if you think lies are intrinsically wrong. So this is a deep issue, I think. And Truman, there are larger questions. At an earlier time, when Father Miscamble and I were debating this issue, he ended, and I don't think you used this line tonight, by saying that you thought Harry Truman was a virtuous man.
Yes.
See, I think that's a complicated thing, but I think I'm willing to argue about that might be true given the way he dealt with lots of things. But if we're thinking about what he did and questions of responsibility and guilt, I think we have to stick with the idea that we are not responsible for the merely foreseen consequences of our unintended actions. And we are responsible for and so we don't have the dilemma.
I think he lets himself off the hook precisely because he becomes a passive bystander while there's enormous amounts of killing going on. He takes no responsibility for all that killing, Japanese carnage throughout Asia, etc. But I say, if Truman had not acted, he would have a lot of that blood on his hands as well. That's where I see the tragic dilemma. Their innocence being killed in every scenario.
But just one brief response to that. You don't have to be purely passive. There are all kinds of things you could do. You could send the Red Cross there. What you can't do is directly kill innocent people, right?
I'm listening to what you would recommend.
Well, sending the Red Cross, but that seems almost trivial in the context of the horrors here. But, yeah.
And again, I'm an economist. I'm not a philosopher, so I don't have my distinctions here down very well. But if Truman made those efforts to try to get the civilian population to evacuate, could we then put his decision in the category of the principle of double effect, where he was intending strictly to defeat the military, and unfortunately this secondary consequence also came about? And we don't have to keep running along this line of thinking. I just want.
There's no telling what Miscamble would accuse me of if I started talking about the principle of double effect here in abstract argument. We'll have to come back another. That's the way the argument could go. Let me say it gets very complicated then. I mean, that's obviously moving to a more complicated level of analysis with this distinction between the intended and the foreseen. So
Thank you.
Let me beg off there.
Professor Patterson.
I appreciate that we're trying to somewhat escape this question, but I'm still a little troubled by this distinction between what we intend and what we foresee. It seems to potentially let some very powerful people off the hook because they, and perhaps I could take pot shots at economists here too, that many economic decisions have, perhaps positive economic effects for, say, shareholders, but devastating effects for people who are poor or for the environment. So I wonder, that seems like a very morally hazardous position to me, and I wonder if you might play it out in other contexts.
So this is directed to David?
I would welcome, any commentary, but it is directed to Dr.
Let me just
Solomon.
punt, because it does seem sort of directed to me. I didn't mean to suggest that it's always easy to distinguish the intended and the merely foreseen, nor do I mean to suggest for a moment that it's not possible for people to corruptly be self-deceived about this. And so that it doesn't make things, this distinction doesn't make things easier. Then we have to think hard about what's really going on when we have forces in sort of advanced capitalist economies that are performing actions that have these incredibly destructive consequences that are foreseen, and then we're going to have a more careful notion of in what sense they're connected to the real goals and enterprises in question. And this is going to involve heavy social scientific stuff. So that you raise a terrific question. It seems to me, in some ways, this case is easier. This is, I suppose, what the heart of the dispute between Father Miscamble and myself is. I think in this case, it's a little clearer than some of those socially complicated cases you suggest. And that's where Monsignor Ford did a whole lot more analysis in the stuff you were reporting on tonight, Professor Marko, than I did. I was laying out the bare bones of the argument. There's a lot more to be said, and let me say that.
I think, Molly, one thing that I'm always struck about, and I mentioned this in passing on, I mentioned King and Gandhi, because we're not always sure of the consequences of our action, therefore we have to focus on the means. Because I don't know what the consequences of my action will be, whether, even intended or unintended. I mean, so I have to be very, very careful about, and I think one of the strengths of a nonviolent approach is to focus specifically on the means, because I don't know what the consequences will be. And I think that has to be put in the equation somehow too. So it isn't what I intend or not intend, and that's I may have great intentions, but I think in the real world, that's why I think the principle of you just don't kill innocent people is an absolute principle, or virtually exceptionalist norm, or whatever people want to call it. But it's an absolute principle. We just, that has to be foremost in our thoughts.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, panel. This has been great. My question is, well, first, I want to acknowledge that both conventional weaponry and nuclear weaponry, like both of them have the potential, which you have talked about, to kill innocents and kill indiscriminately. Yeah. And so, but when it comes in with nuclear power, there's larger political action, and especially in the Cold War, like with deterrence and everything, so there's potential for peace. Can this potential for peace resulting from nuclear weapons, can that somehow morally cancel out their potential for mass destruction and killing of so many people?
I'll have a crack at it, but I would think Professor Marko may be the most equipped to respond.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question too, Bill? I couldn't quite get the gist of it.
Distinctions between nuclear power and conventional power. Both can take innocent lives. Both can take innocent lives. But there's almost like a beneficial, dare I use the word, consequence of nuclear power that can serve as this sort of deterrent and preserve a kind of peace.
Yes,
right?
because it has such a large reaction. From especially in the international community.
I'm glad you raised the point about conventional power, of course. Not that either of my colleagues would in any way endorse or justify, but of course the Tokyo fire bombings, which FDR expressed very little regret or concern, took more lives than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. So we know of that kind of power. That's why I say that was easily predicted that kind of bombing would continue in Japan during a period of time until the Japanese government might have worked out to surrender. But to your point, I believe deterrence as a strategy was morally acceptable, and sort of come down somewhat where the U.S. bishops eventually got in the challenge of peace, that until there was an opportunity for arms control and disarmament and so on, it was the most kind of appropriate way to maintain a nuclear balance to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, to prevent a conflict. So it does involve a threatening of the other side, but that's how this sort of terrible balance was maintained. I wouldn't say that you would develop up your nuclear capability just to be able to have that sort of beneficial side impact, but given that each side had nuclear weapons, I think deterrence was morally acceptable as long as the Western side was working for arms control and perhaps some disarmament.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Father Miscamble. The bishops in their letter moved from a position in an early draft to curbing the production of nuclear weapons to holding them, but there is a I said their position is kind of a virtual nuclear pacifist position, but it doesn't get rid of them. And if the point is that does deterrence work? I don't know if it worked, but I know that it did not work. You understand? In other words, I don't know how, I sound as confused as I do in class. But you know, it did not work. And I think, therefore, if they were to conclude, quite candidly, that there's not even a use of a possible tactical nuclear weapon, then I think you certainly would have to eliminate them. But the consequences would be worse in that case. I don't want to sound like a consequentialist utilitarian. But
I was about to make that point myself.
Exactly. I mean, it is a position like that. If you're a purist like John Finnis and Germain Grisey, you say, you know, no, you got to get rid of them, right? I was kidding Barrows. Where's Barrows? You still here?
Yeah.
I was kidding Barrows. I said it's like the bishops say you can't use nuclear weapons, can't intend to use them, can't threaten to use them, but you can keep them. I said, we never say that about condoms, right? You know, you can just keep them. I mean, we'd never say that. But it becomes it's an interesting question. I think the realistic position was, in reality, what is going to be a less cause of nuclear war? And the purist position, the philosopher's position, Grisey and Finnis and all you heavy hitters would say, no, you got to get rid of them. And of course, you neocons' position was, no, the Russians are so bad, we got to keep them and we got to strengthen them. So you got people like Weigel and Michael Novak saying, yeah, you know, we got to really we got to beef them up. And then when Iraq comes, we got to go tell the Pope that keep your mouth shut on this issue. So I mean, it's a complicated issue. All right. Enough said.
Well, you know, I think you guys have said all needs to be said. I don't think you should suppose that philosophers who hold my sort of view should end up having to agree with people like John Finnis. I mean, what John Finnis wanted us to do was melt down the nuclear weapons, surrender to the Russians, and corrupt them from the inside, invite them into the West, and we'd corrupt them with consumerism and win the Cold War that way. That's not my view. But
let me say though, David, the reason it's not your view is that you worry what the consequences would have been. Isn't it true? Isn't it true? But you worry what the consequences of a sort of universal disarmament would have been, because in the real world you have to make that calculation, and you are making.
Of course, this is a historian's oversimplification of our objection to consequentialism, Father. Because to give up on consequentialism is not to suppose that we can never look at the consequences of action. To give up on consequentialism is to believe that consequences are not the only thing that determine the rightness of actions. And that you're still, of course, we're all going to have to look at consequences.
Yeah.
Ben, please.
Thank you, professors. In a democratic republic, how much moral culpability can be placed on the citizens?
Well, there's no doubt that the larger share of responsibility must go to the policymakers. The citizenry of the United States were completely unaware of this new weapon. There was no opportunity to get some endorsement of it. So looking at the decision for the use of the atomic bombs, I don't see a large moral culpability to that specific thing. Nonetheless, the reason the policymakers, of course, had pursued the kind of actions that we're talking about, the obliteration bombing and so on, was because the enormous casualties of aircraft, the numbers of planes and air crews being shot down this is over Germany initially, where the United States reluctantly moved. The British moved much more quickly, of course, to night bombing and essentially to bomber Harris and obliteration bombing. They moved to it because they could see all their planes and crews being shot down, And that was fueled by the concern of people, their sons are being, blown out of the sky. It wasn't done by democratic vote. You could just sense the angst of a population. And of course, Churchill was playing to a population that was being bombed itself, and he wanted to be able to say to them, we're doing something back to those Nazis. So there's a kind of limited culpability that there are public pressures that drive policymakers. But I'll tell you this, Truman knew that he probably would have been impeached if it had been found that he had the possibility to have ended the war with those weapons, and yet he had stood aside and allowed an invasion in which 100,000 American boys had been killed. So the pressure of the public's sentiment was weighing on him. The sentiment was weighing. But I don't see it as the public itself being, in a democratic society being public. It's just politicians make their decisions partly on the basis of what they think their people want.
Margaret, is that you?
It is.
Hey,
How you
welcome.
doing?
Hello. I'm just wondering how it changes the discussion from either side, and maybe I'm underestimating what we knew, but since the weapon was untested and we didn't necessarily know what its effects were going to be, how that affects the moral reasoning on both sides.
Yeah, there'd been the one test at Alamogordo in New Mexico, but these weapons were completely new. Truman sort of goes back and forth. On some days he thought it was going to be, this enormous blast, and, this was the power of the sun and all that sort of stuff. Other days he had someone like Admiral Leahy saying to him, these things aren't going to work. It's just going to be a dud. That was one of the reasons why the idea of a demonstration was completely rejected. One, they feared the Japanese would move POWs into any site where they thought that they would pull off a demonstration. Two, they thought it would take months to just handle the logistics of setting up a site where there could be Japanese observers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's some grounds for saying that because there was less certainty about the weapons, Truman didn't have the same level of certainty as to the extent of the destruction that it would cause, etc. Whereas anyone acting in light of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or in light of, say, the H-bomb testing, knows the extent of the damage. The destruction varied city to city. Because Nagasaki was a quite hilly city, significant parts of Nagasaki were not destroyed. So I think there is something to how much they knew about the weapon. I don't think it changes the moral calculus that much.
I was struck, I don't want to act like a salesman for Father Miscamble's book, but I was struck by what a view I took away from your account of the discussions, that Truman didn't seem to be so terribly interested in this bomb in one sense. He wasn't at all sure it would work. Yeah. And he seemed to be distracted, and he was pursuing a million different policies.
He's at the
story
Potsdam
you tell,
conference and so on.
And I think that probably does have a lot to do with his responsibility in another sense, because he did, on your telling, which seems to come from the right sources, he was shocked at what it did. He didn't think of himself as moving through to a new kind of weapon and moving to a new era in energy. There were a bunch of eggheads coming and telling him about this thing, and he constantly referred to it, as I recall, as you say, as the big bomb. He just thought of it as a bigger bomb than the one they had last week, and he did seem shocked that it was such a big bomb when it happened.
Yeah, he was.
I've just gotten the signal that the even more important timekeepers than me have made a ruling. So we only have a few minutes left. Eamon, if you could ask a quick question.
I'm sorry, this seems like a silly or obvious question, but earlier in the discussion, it was mentioned a consistent wave of bombing as contrasted with the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Could it be agreed that in order for the atomic bomb to have the shock value that it did, that it had to be contrasted with the already sort of day-to-day bombings that were going on in Japan at the time?
Yes, that was the whole point. Of course, General Curtis LeMay's Air Force had been engaged in sustained bombing of Japanese cities, and of course with the firebombing of Tokyo with these incendiary weapons that set fire to the sort of wood housing and so on, created a great conflagration. But that had not had any impact whatsoever on the resolve of the Japanese military. These are samurai who are wanting to fight to the death. They're going to draw it out right to the end. 20 million casualties wouldn't have bothered them. So the distinction with the atomic bomb was that it might have some shock value on the Japanese leadership. And I maintain, there's dispute among historians about this, but I maintain it did. Not that it changed the mind of the Japanese military, but it changed the mind of the emperor, Hirohito. And so there's a 3-3, this is after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet entry into the war. There's still a 3-3 tie in the Japanese war cabinet. And Hirohito descends from the sun god's throne and says to them, we've got to surrender here. We've got to surrender. And some folks make a lot of the fact that the Americans changed the surrender terms. But in the Potsdam Conference declaration, they had said the Japanese people will determine their future course of government. Truman and his Secretary of State, James F. Burns, said the terms must be these. The emperor must subject himself to the Supreme Allied Commander. It was going to be General Douglas MacArthur. Can you imagine? The Japanese emperor is under an American general. Japan was forced to surrender unconditionally, and the emperor's long-term fate was going to be up to the determination of the Japanese people. So I don't see a big issue there about surrender terms. Sorry if that's, maybe I'm not making much sense, but anyway.
On that note, why don't we thank our speakers very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming.